I changed the title. It still relates to my original title, but I wanted to broaden it because it's kind of a broader topic about online privacy in general. So I'm now calling this the battle for online privacy, but it is the original GDPR and privacy 1 year later. All right, so a quick introduction about me. I think if I haven't met you, I work with an agency called Electric Citizen. I've been doing web design since 1998 or so. So 20 plus years. I've been working with Drupal for over 10 years. I'm on Twitter, Minneapolis Dan, and same with Drupal.org, same username. I work for Electric Citizen. We are a web agency based out of Minneapolis, full service strategy, design, development, and support, primarily Drupal, open source advocates. We focus on the civic sector, so that for us means government, higher ed, nonprofits, arts, science, health, those sort of clients. And we're online at electriccitizen.com. So today, what we're going to cover, why privacy still matters, which is, I sort of needed to prove to myself this theory, so I wanted to share that with you. We're going to talk about the GDPR, what that is, what it means, and what's happened since it became the law in Europe. We're going to talk about privacy experience and how that affects the way you might work with a website. The CCPA, a new law coming to the USA starting in January. And then since it's a Drupal conference, we'll just touch on some Drupal specific topics as well. All right, so first of all, what led to the privacy laws? And I feel like more and more this talk is extremely relevant. Not that I'm extremely relevant, but the topic is extremely relevant because privacy is just starting to really dominate our headlines. Even just this past week, the New York Times released or compiled a whole dedicated section on their news site about privacy articles, privacy topics. Just in my hotel room yesterday, they were talking about Facebook and app developers selling off data of users they didn't know about, and even after they said they didn't want to, Facebook said they weren't doing it, then the app developers still were doing it. So it just feels very timely. But what led to the laws, things like outdated privacy laws. In Europe and the United States, a lot of those laws regarding privacy were written well before the modern internet. Very well-known, well-publicized data breaches at Yahoo, Facebook, and Equifax. The impossible-to-read privacy policies that we all see and agree to every time we download an app or join a service. And I think it's fair to say no one really reads those. And if you did, you wouldn't understand them. And then, famously, companies like Cambridge Analytica. Actually, with that one, I knew it was bad, but I don't know if anyone understood exactly why it was bad. But they were harvesting data and then selling it to a political campaign who used that to target users unwittingly on Facebook to influence an election. So, of course, disclaimer, obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so anything I say can't be held against me, but I'm going to do my best to share good information today. I did actually, when I was in high school, I did say I was going to grow up to be a lawyer, but that never happened. People said I was so good at arguing with people that I should be a lawyer. So. All right, so before we begin, I know that for me, and I don't know if this is something that crosses your mind, but what's the big deal? Why does privacy matter? I was at a conference last month where the keynote speaker, in the middle of his talk, one of his catchphrases is "privacy is dead." So, get over it. You just got to lean into that reality. And I don't think he was saying good or making a judgment call. He certainly didn't seem to be bothered by it, which bothered me. He was just saying everything's out there, and you have to just worry about what's in the public sphere, because that's all that matters. And if it's true, privacy is dead, then none of this matters, right? The laws and anything. But I hope it's not entirely true. But some of the other reasons people say privacy is dead is, everything's already exposed and shared anyway, so, the genie's out of the bottle, you can't do anything about it at this point. Or I have nothing to hide, so what's the problem? Or I get free services, in exchange for letting people track my data, all these free things like Google Maps and those sort of apps. Or is it better to get a personalized ad as you're browsing instead of random ones? Does that make your life better? Is that a better experience? Do we want facial recognition at concerts, supposedly to help someone, that they can track everyone in the audience and run them through a facial recognition database? This is I guess a privacy expert, if you will, someone I've been reading a bit about. His quote is, most people seem to be willing to sacrifice privacy in return for convenience, and I think that's true to an extent, and but it's probably also we don't realize necessarily what we're giving up. And again, to sort of to bring this to a close, for me, an analogy that worked pretty well is imagine someone following you the entire day and recording what you eat, who you talk to, where you drove to, what you did on your computer, what you're reading, what you're thinking. And if that was the case in the real world, it'd feel creepy, right? I mean, does anyone feel like that would not be creepy? And decried is wrong, but buying and selling your information online for profit doesn't feel creepy to a lot of us, and I wondered why that was, or what the difference was. Probably because most of us think, personal safety, like if this was following you around town, you'd probably be a little scared versus just a cookie that you don't really see following you online. And since I don't have my presenter, if you want to take that up. All right, so again, why is privacy online important? Privacy is a limit on power and control. It's about respect for others. It can affect, your information can affect not only your reputation, whether you get hired or not. Employees are looking at whatever data you have out there to decide whether they're going to hire you. It can affect getting a loan, getting a house, or even the news that we see is affected by what personal information is collected about us. So it is a form of control, right? And it can limit your freedom of expression if someone wants to explore ideas that maybe their family or community isn't in favor of. You don't want them to be limited to exploring something maybe outside of their religious group or what have you, or political belief, or seeing ads that protecting vulnerable groups, like ads were targeting poor, largely minority groups for high interest loans, and because they had that privacy data about those people, they knew who to target with these loans and how to appeal to them. So even if it may not be an issue for you, maybe it's an issue for them, and so if we all agree to protect online privacy, it can be not just about us, but about people that aren't sharing maybe in wherever we're at. And also, you don't know what personal information might be an issue. Like you might be a nobody, so to speak, and you tweet something and it seems innocuous, but it sets someone off, and like imagine you set off a white supremacist, and then they once you found out where you lived, or they decided to dox you or something like that. So there is many reasons, and I think as web developers, site owners, and organizations, we all have a role to play in whether or not this becomes the norm to protect privacy or not. It's not just the big corporation. So getting back to the GDPR, who here is familiar with the GDPR, or at least has heard of it? Most of you have heard of it. So I'm not going to get into all the details because that would be a whole presentation in itself, but I can talk about just the base values and sort of what's happened since it became law. So it's been effective since May 2018, so about a year and a half, right? And at the base level, it gives users rights to protect their personal data. And it means that it affects anyone with a temporary or permanent residence in the EU. So if there's some confusion of who it applies to, basically, if you're traveling abroad as an American, you're living in the European Union, then you're protected by this law. Or if you were born in England and you come live here in the United States, you still have residency in the EU, you're protected even while you're here. So, interestingly enough, so one of the things that prompted my talk as well was the thought that this law came into effect, and it was sort of a sudden storm of attention, and this is going to happen soon, what are you doing? And some people were worried or panicking, and then it became in effect, and for most of us, I think, in the United States anyway, it was like, nothing happened, who cares? I guess it was a false alarm, right? Right, so for us, at least, did it have any effect on you, right? Was it a big game-changing event, or was it like, just some legal mumbo-jumbo that doesn't really matter? But I'm going to talk, hopefully, about why it does. So a quick summary of the protections, the outline of the major protections that the law gives its constituents. Number one is breach notifications. If there's a data breach, the organization is legally obligated to make that public and share. So many companies today, even in the United States, can have these happen and decide not to share. It's not necessarily they're compelled to. No one knows about it. So they often do share, but there's no necessarily a legal punishment if they don't. So access to personal data, you are guaranteed a right to be able to ask for and see what data they have on you and share it. You have a right to be forgotten, which means you can say to an organization, I want you to delete all the personal information you have about me, and they have to do that. And to be able to do that, they have to have systems in place that can make that happen quickly. It can't just be some random scramble. Data portability, that means that you have to be able to have the mechanism to click and export all your personal data that's on that site and take it and bring it to your own computer or do whatever you want with it. Maybe move it to another system because it's your data, it's not theirs. They don't own it. Privacy by design, which is, there's ways like in Facebook, for example, you can go in now and they have a lot of privacy controls that you can dig through and find and say, or Google, you can say, don't keep my map data for forever, delete it after 30 days. But you have to dig these out and find them. And privacy by design says you're not going to track anyone's data unless they opt in instead of opt out. So that's a major shift. And lastly, because of these changes, there's a requirement for certain size organizations to have new positions in their companies, such as a data protection officer, to handle these responsibilities and responses to consumers. Yeah?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm thinking in terms of faculty members who have access to add information in regards to like their people profile and or as much as they want, and they're opting to do that. And then does this mean that a visiting professor that's here on campus where these rights would protect them, they have to be able to export all data anywhere that they put about themselves?
You mean, so does your organization have to provide that to them because they are a European Union citizen? That's an excellent question for a lawyer. I don't know, but it would seem to implicate that that's the case. So definitely something to look into. Yeah. But again, who needs to comply? This is the GDPR for the people it protects. Anyone offering goods and services outside of personal use, anyone collecting personal data, anyone organization who could envisage serving EU users. So you don't even necessarily have to know, but if you're advertising to someone in the European Union to buy your product or join your service, then you could envisage serving European Union users. So then you have to take this law into account. And what's interesting is it could be for-profit or non-profit in any size organization. They don't draw distinctions, unlike some of the laws that are currently being discussed in the United States. Who doesn't need to comply? Governments and law enforcement. That at first might sound insidious, but then it just sounds silly that, of course, the government of your country would need to have your personal information to do taxes and legal things. Data for personal use, it doesn't matter. And of course, organizations with no connection to EU residents, which is some of us or a lot of us. It depends on who you work for, what you do.
Can I just ask about how do they define that? I mean, because it's the internet. Somebody from Germany visits your website, gets information off of it. Are you certain?
That's a good question. Again, not a lawyer, but I would think if you just have a visitor to your site, that's fine because you're not collecting. Well, you could be collecting their data.
Yeah, if it automatically puts a cookie on it.
Well, and is that collecting their data? That's debatable depending on what you're tracking, right? For example, if you're not taking their personal information, that's not considered tracking. If you're tracking their IP address, that's debatable. There are ways to not do that, though. So again, a good question. I apologize. I don't have a ton of answers to some of those specific cases, other than to say be aware of it and ask a lawyer to see if you. But I don't think it's a problem unless you're advertising to that specific constituency. Yes.
I'd say that it's an ongoing hazy legal issue, but there was this movement in 2018 that continues, where a bunch of U.S. sites were literally at a firewall level blocking European traffic.
Well, that is one option that people said is their solution to dealing with this law, is to block anyone or to serve up. Actually, it's highly common now. If you look at some of these sites like Apple and Facebook or whatever, they'll have different cookies depending on where you're from. So if you're from the United States and you're visiting Apple's site, you might get 17 different trackers all doing different things to your data. And if they see that you're from the European Union, you get more limited tracking. So that's how some companies are dealing with that. But what's happened in the year since? So fines of almost $360 billion in fines have already been doled out. So it's not a law without teeth. As you can see in these examples, I think on the day it went into effect, Google was fined $50 million for some tracking issues. I think that was in France. British Airways, $183 million. Marriott, $99 million. So they are enforcing it, although from what I understand, they are focusing on the most egregious offenders. So they're not trying to track down, everybody in little companies or people that just maybe they have a Google Analytics tracker on your site in the United States and you had 3 European Union visitors in a month. They're not really going after those people. They're going after the most egregious offenders. It also has led to a renewed focus on privacy experience, which was a new term for me, and it's something that I'm kind of excited about. I'm going to talk about in the next section. There's additional laws still being considered in the EU, and then it really inspired new laws in the USA, such as the CCPA, which is a California privacy law, which goes into effect at the start of next year. And we'll also touch on that. Some of the GDPR lessons to remember, I like this first one because it relates in my mind to something that I've learned and said about accessibility with the web, is that it's a journey, not a destination. It's not something that you fix once and you're done forever. It's something that you have to constantly, or continually, that's a friendlier way to say it, continually revisit from time to time to make sure you're in compliance. And it can apply, this can apply to any size business. You just have to be prepared to respond to a breach in data, because depending on who you are in your organization, it seems to be like the norm that at some point you will get breached. So have a plan in place. And then rethink, lastly, how you handle personal data. And really what that leads into is this focus on PX, which is private experience. Has anyone heard that term before? Few nods. This is just my own note here, but for all of us in here in the room who are site owners, editors, web developers, trainers, etc., we have access, depending on the project and the client, to a lot of personal data when we're working with websites. And the question is, how careful are we with it? I would say that best case scenario, we're very careful. The realist in me says we probably haven't been as careful as we should be. But what does that mean? So PX is yet another important thing to know. There's always piling on with when you work in this field of all the crap we have to know. And it's all good stuff, but it does sort of, it's amazing how much knowledge we are forced to adapt to. So just like, we have to know about accessibility now, which is great. We had to learn about responsive design. We have always had to learn about user experience, but there's been more of a focus on that, site performance. I think that the lesson here is that privacy experience needs to be part of every project, or at least considered, and plan for user privacy and security. Usually, on a lot of web projects, maybe before launch, someone says, oh, we should have a privacy policy, and it gets thrown up there, and that's about the extent of the privacy decision making that's been done with the site, not what data are we collecting. How are you going to protect PII, which is personal identifying information, and what is PII? I don't know if people pronounce that as PI or not, but so it's all these things. By itself, personal identifying information, your name, mother's maiden name, Social Security, of course, your address, your face, fingerprints. The last one I think is interesting, the IP address, which you wouldn't think would be personally identifying, but if someone tracks that to, even though it doesn't know your name perhaps, but it knows that this person is out there and that they've visited the site repeatedly, they can target that person. And so that's something that is debatable, but it does fall into these definitions. And then on the right are things that not by itself are PII, but when you combine them with the column on the left, they become that personal data. I have my printed notes because I don't have my presenter notes on the screen for me, but I don't think I've really read them so far. So let's see. They're just a little security blanket. Okay, so PX, follow transparent policies. That means you consider at least having people opt into data collection as opposed to just offering a way to opt out. You don't have to do this, but it could very well go that way soon, so maybe you want to start. Provide ample documentation on how you're using people's data. Set expiration dates on data. Do you need to, if you're a Drupal site and you have a web form and you have people submit contact information, does that need to stay on the site for years and years? Can it be just deleted after 30 days? Can users view what data is being saved, and can they export their personal data? These are maybe aspirational goals at this stage for us, but again, something to at least start considering how we can meet these what seem to be reasonable standards that a user could ask to have their data not be saved with your site, and how can you react to that? So this next slide, I just give a quick shout out to a guy who gave a talk at Twin Cities Drupal Camp in 2018 about GDPR. Ocean Kalen, he is a lawyer, so interestingly enough, so he, even though he had the same disclaimers, I thought the way he explained PX was good. So the idea that you're collecting data as needed. So you only collect personal data you need at this time, and what that means is sometimes you'll have sign-up forms or whatnot, or applications, and you'd say, well, why do we have to know where this person lived before or worked? And someone else will say, well, I don't know, we might use that data later. So what this says is, no, just keep it to what you actually need, and instead of just stockpiling as much data as you can just for the sake of stockpiling it. This next word I'm going to stumble on, pseudonymization. So that's the idea that you don't attribute personal data to individuals in your records. That obviously gets a little tricky, but there are some mechanisms and techniques for developers to do this sort of task. It would add a lot of these things to your time and budget for the project, but it's something to consider, especially if there's a legal risk. And technical planning, again, decide before you launch how you're going to handle people's personal data. Add that to your discovery planning process instead of just making it an afterthought before the site launches or after it launches.
So I'm going to jump in with a question.
Yeah.
As we talk about data and personal data. Has anybody here in the room done a data inventory within your sites or applications, or are you using a particular tool for data management?
We did it and had to establish a legal basis by which we were collecting data, what data we were keeping. That whole process as an exercise.
And what organization you with?
To the College of Business.
Okay, at Iowa. Mm-hmm. And then what tool did you use to track that?
Excel.
Okay.
Like, it was a very manual process. We did not have an automated magic tool that made it seamless.
And how long did it take you to do it?
We had multiple people working on various pieces of it. The website is just one component of this. There's data coming in from all sorts of channels. And so I wouldn't know how to estimate man hours or person hours, but I think we started and got more or less done within a month. But it was work.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things, if you're any web developers in the audience here or who work with web developers, frequently you'll download data to have a local copy of a site, right? That's how developers work. So let's say you're working with an organization and you have access to 500 member records, and it has their name and address and phone number and I don't know what other data. You're pulling that down to your local machine. How protected is that? What if your machine got lost? That's such a frequent line in so many privacy breach stories, is that someone lost their laptop or it was stolen, and then suddenly all that data was exposed. How do you deal with that? It's gonna take some extra work, but you could scrub your database before you download it of that personal information. You could use an online plugin or tool. There's one called Faker that will populate data with fake user information. It's an extra step. It adds work for your developers. I guess it's up to your organization to decide maybe on the type of data they're handling, whether that's worth it, but it's something to consider. And again, with a Drupal crowd, you could set up cron jobs also to go into your site and periodically delete personal data that you don't need anymore. It doesn't have to stay in your database forever. And then lastly, have a privacy policy. That's something that it seems like the bare minimum, but so many sites don't. And to be completely transparent, we didn't either until I started doing this talk, and I was like, crap, we don't have a privacy policy, so now we do. Is it the best? Probably not, because I put it together like most people do. I searched on the web and found things that made sense and tried to say it in a language that people could understand. But I probably should run it by a lawyer sometime.
So have you used Faker?
Oh, so Faker is if you have a database of personal records and it'll just populate that with fake data. Right. Oh, do we use it on our site? So no. This is all new for us as well. So this is something that we're definitely not on the mountain looking down on you. We're at the bottom with most people. Yes. All right, so I had to work in one silly photo of my slides here, but apparently that's the stock photo of a data thief who wears a ski mask while he's hacking a computer. But plan for disasters. How are you going to respond to data breaches when they happen? Do you have a lawyer you can talk to about what, where you're exposed, where you need to be protected, what you need to be doing, and who's in charge in your organization for privacy if and when something happens? All right. So lastly, on this section, accessibility isn't required everywhere yet either. I say either because recent legal cases that used to be more federally funded organizations, but that'll be probably expanding in the future. But I think accessibility, it's still, even if it's not required, it seems to be the right thing to do, and I think it will be required everywhere soon, and perhaps that same paradigm will apply to privacy experience in the future. Or not, depending on who's in office, but who knows? All right, so, but there are things that are happening in the United States. Interestingly enough, the United States is one of the only democracies in the world that does not have a federally defined online privacy policy. So that's really lacking. The GDPR was a response to all the different countries in the European Union developing their own policies, and they would conflict, and no one knew which one to apply, so they said, let's just have a unified one. And I think it probably will go the way it went there, although in our own unique American way. But so California is one of the leaders now, pushing a new law out in January 1st called the CCPA. Has everyone heard of that? Anyone not heard of it? This guy. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so what is it? It's the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's effective January 1st, 2020. That's less than 2 months. What does it do? It establishes privacy rights for residents of California, including rights to know what personal data is being collected by a website. You know if that data is being sold or disclosed to others. It gives you ability to opt out of sale of your personal data. It's not as strict as GDPR in requiring an opt-in to tracking, but you have to offer that opt-out. You can request, just like the GDPR request to be forgotten, you can request your personal data to be deleted. And you also have the right to not be discriminated against for saying, I want my privacy rights exercised. In other words, if you say, I want to use your site, but I don't want you to track me, you still have to get the same experience as someone who says, I don't care, go ahead. Who does comply? So this is, again, the difference for the GDPR. This one only affects for-profit businesses. So all the nonprofits of the world and higher education and government, they're all free to ignore this. At least that's my reading of it. But it's anyone who's for-profit collecting personal data and does business in California. So again, that can be a broad definition. If you are based here in Iowa, but you have people buying your product that live in California, then you have to comply with this. There are some other restrictions. You have to have annual revenues over 25 million or process personal info of 50,000 or more people in a year. That might sound like a lot, but it's actually not too hard to get to that if you have like 10,000 visitors to your site a month and you're collecting their analytics, for example. You hit that threshold pretty quickly. Or if you're earning your revenue from selling personal data, that's your business, then you have to comply. Who's exempt? Nonprofits and organizations with no customers residing in California or residents of California. So again, that definition, if someone is a resident of California and is in your state using your website, they're protected. All this is new, right? So it's very nebulous how this will be enforced or applied. I think I'm presenting it here more as be aware that this is happening. Look into how it applies to your organization and see how it gets enforced, because even people in California aren't entirely sure yet how it's going to roll out, but these things are developing.
So have you heard anything about how Google Analytics is going to handle that? I know that with GDPR, they implemented the ability to set the timer for how long the data was retained.
Okay.
So that you could, shorten it and have it, and then essentially you lose that, which, I love that historical view of traffic and information on the...
If there's a way to anonymize your data, I think then you can keep it. It's just avoiding everything down to that IP address. Then I think you're safe. Meeting the requirements here means implementing and maintaining reasonable security procedures, asking for parental consent for younger kids if they're going to opt into whatever you're selling or offering. Clearly visible opt-out links, toll-free number for data access, and make sure your privacy policy is up to date. We're running short of time, so I'm going to speed up here a little bit, but we're almost done. So some of the major differences: CCPA only covers information covered by consumers, not data purchased from third parties. And there's these exemptions for nonprofits and small businesses, so it doesn't apply universally. But there are other states next up. These are 4 states that are all currently debating and considering privacy laws. And they're not all the same. And then there are states such as Nevada that already implemented a privacy policy, and there are people wondering that are on the border of California and Nevada, how do I comply with both these laws? And what I think it's leading to is this push for a federal law that'll just cover everything instead of, because it really gets impossible if you're trying to meet privacy requirements for all 50 states and they all have different rules. So it's a bit of a mess right now, but it's definitely something to be aware of. And also, this was an interesting little article I found on US News. They looked at current privacy policies and laws in the different states and how consumers are protected, and they came up with a magic scoring system. You can see here that California, the darkest, is the top one. The worst for now is Wyoming. Iowa, unfortunately, was second lowest score with 10, so we're not so great up in Minnesota either, but so definitely you can see, at least by this metrics, that California is sort of leading the way, but we'll see where this goes. Since this is a web conference, just technically speaking, I'm going to have to skip over this quickly, but both of these laws in Europe and California require you to disclose the use of cookies. Cookies required to make your site functional do not require consent. So if you're having a shopping cart, you need to track that session that says, I added this to my cart. You're not going to have to ask someone permission to do that because that's how your site works. But anything else does. And then when it comes to site analytics, does Google Analytics collect PII? You can disclose the use of it in your privacy policy. You don't have to collect IP addresses if that becomes a major issue. Again, that's some matter of debate, but there are ways to opt out of that. And I don't know if anyone's ever used this. I have not, but there's an open source analytics. Has anyone used Matumo or Matomo? I don't know how you say it, but in my research I came across that. You have used that.
We use that.
Oh, you do? How do you like it?
We love it. We used it for a long time. Actually, it was P-Wig before it was Matomo.
It's Matomo is how you say it?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's how I say it.
Yeah.
I can't tell you. I don't know. It was P-Wig before it changed names, and I don't know if that's how you pronounce that either.
Okay.
But that's what we're using in our team now. And
Yeah.
I really like it. It gives me pretty much everything I need.
Yeah, and then you run that on your own server, and you don't need to have anyone else looking at your data. Drupal specific, Again, we're kind of out of time, but just note that there's a ton of modules and initiatives related to privacy. There's the GDPR compliance team is a good place to start on Drupal.org. They list a lot of these modules that I have here. One of the ones that our company has found useful is the EU cookie compliance. I know that's sort of the major outcome for a lot of people from the GDPR is you visit sites and they all say, do you accept our cookies? And it's kind of a pain, especially on mobile phones when it takes up half your screen and you're constantly having to say yes, fine, and you don't even read it because you don't care. But it's all well-intentioned and good, and maybe we'll find a way to make that a better user experience. So check out some of these modules on Drupal.org. Again, don't collect more data than is needed. Have a privacy policy in place. Interestingly enough, last little nugget, if you embed a YouTube player on your page, it will track activity on your site, whether the user is playing the video or not. So there's ways around that. You could just have a still image of a video, and then that links off to the player, or triggers the player. So final takeaways. Does privacy still matter? I think enough citizens and state legislators and governments are saying it does. It's something that can apply everywhere, and we all can play a role. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. I know that we're over time, so if anyone wants to leave, that's fine, or I can just stay up here and talk.
I wanted to say that with Matomo, if you're used to like Google sending reports or that kind of thing, Matomo does that as well. Like it'll allow you to send reports to site owners as well, automatically, monthly, or however you want.
That's great.
And you can specify the detail of that, so you can decide how much, how complicated you want that to be, the data that you don't want to go through.